whose 10 novels have just been an absolute joy to read over the last 4 decades, even before we came up to congratulate him as Nobel Literature Laureate in 2021. Please take your seats. I'm going to try and make sure that we have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. So if you'd like to, think about how you want to frame your question, this is a good time to start. Abdulrazak, it's absolutely wonderful to see you in Kolkata, which is a city that reads a lot, that is immersed in writing. And I wondered whether I could start with your boyhood in Zanzibar, crossroads of the Indian Ocean. And you started off by listening to stories from people like your mother, your aunts, your grandmother, and you read pretty much everything that you could get your hands on, even though bookstores and libraries were limited. And then at 18, after the revolution, after the elected government was unseated, you took yourself off to England, an alien, strange land. And out there again, you found a kind of home in the libraries and bookstores over there. So, could you tell us a little bit about what reading meant to you and how it started to take you towards writing?
Is this on? Yep. Okay. Uh, Thank you. We had a conversation before. I seem to remember, but it started with now it's wonderful to be here in Kolkata, and I thought you were going to ask me something about Kolkata. Instead, you asked me about what it was like growing up. Okay, I'll try. It wasn't like a mission thing about reading. I suppose it must have just been something that gave me pleasure, and perhaps gave a lot of us pleasure. Uh, the the scarcity of it, in other words, the scarcity of books probably contributed to a kind of hunger for it, so that you're reading the same book again and again and again and again. I even remember reading and rereading my school textbooks because because there was nothing else to read, so you just read whatever. So the your comment about reading everything also though has to be kind of put in context in the sense that there was a scarcity of books. Uh, One of the really interesting things, um, there are a lot of things that were not interesting about going to England at age of 18, but one of the interesting things was just how much there was available to read in contrast to uh, to what I've just described about growing up. And that was, I think that was the beginning of really understanding something like literature, not writing yet, but literature could be something, w- um, I might want to turn into a career or turn, kind of like devote myself to, because there was just so much and it was so widening and so opening that I thought this is something I would like to do, even though that's not what we were told as we were growing up that it's worth doing. What was worth doing was becoming a doctor or lawyer or the thing, you know what I mean. Uh, but it was there, I think, in that discovery of so much reading that I began to think that this is really exciting and this is something I would like to do.
Somewhere where you might find a sense of home, even though you were so far from home.
Uh, I guess so. I guess it was a kind of home. It was more like a kind of purpose, really. Something to because it was actually quite difficult to persuade anybody else, that is to say, in my family, that this was something worth doing. And so, in the end, when I did decide to go and become a student of literature, it was against the wishes of anybody who I would normally have obeyed.
And I was thinking about what you've written sometimes about writing your first book, Memory of Departure. Excuse me, the sound team, could I request you to cut the echo on both our mics and just up the volume a little bit? Thanks so much. So, Memory of Departure grew out of notes that you were writing more or less for yourself, sketches, perhaps something like diary entries. And I was astounded. I had to remind myself that this was the England of the 1960s. You began writing it in your 20s, if I'm not wrong. And it was published when you were 39 because the barriers to publishing were that high.
Yeah, I suppose I finished the first draft, although I didn't think at the time it was a draft. I thought it was the job's done. Uh, uh, yeah, I was about 23, maybe 24, but it took a long time for it to be published, which I don't suppose is an altogether unique experience. There are many writers who've had, not all writers, but many writers have had experiences like that. And what did happen in the meantime between submitting that first draft and actually was accepted to be published in the Heinemann series, the African Writers series. They were going to do it, but then it was sent to somebody else to read in nearer home, as it were. And they thought, no, 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 we don't want this. So then Heinemann withdrew their offer, which in the long run probably wasn't a bad thing, because what it did force me to do over the intervening years, when I was actually also writing my PhD, and I was also revising this novel. So it went through many years of being sent and returned. Uh, in those days, sorry, I'm going to sound like an old man, but in those days, you couldn't just attach your manuscript or whatever and send it to a publisher or an agent. You had to send a really bulky thing through the post. Um, and if it wasn't asked for by, in other words, if you didn't have an agent, then it sat in some pile somewhere. And maybe 3 months later, you would get a little letter, which is probably a photocopied letter, that says, we don't think this is for us. And then you have to start the process again. So part of the explanation for such a long time was because it took such a long time for that back and forth to happen. But, in the meantime, I was constantly working at this thing. I suppose I was learning how to write, if I could put it like that, if the result was, as it were, something successful. But in any case, I was learning. Um, but it took a good decade or more before it actually got published.
I was curious about that because in that time, again, you were up against many barriers, not just to publishing, but I remember the literary world of that time as being fairly openly racist or, pro empire. And what was it that writing gave you in those years? What was it that made you want to stay there? What did you see?
Uh, I think in the first place it was to do with just trying to understand things and work things out. Um, it was a very difficult experience at that age to to leave everybody, to leave country, family, and so on, and to go to an England that wasn't. I didn't know anything about England really. I thought I did, but I didn't, and it was difficult, as it is. I think probably difficult for anybody who's such a complete stranger to another place. That is, so there is that dimension, and the associated histories of hostility, or histories of kind of self-representation that made it difficult for, I think, for England to be open to people like me at that time. So that's one thing. But the other thing is, and I think this often when I look at or listen to people who have relocated or who have migrated or whatever the word might be, whether they're refugees or whether they're voluntary migrants, I think, but what it is they've left behind. So that's the other thing I think that people, particularly as I say, a young person of 18, poor, unskilled, etc., you're not only dealing with what you're faced with there in a place that's difficult and you don't know. You don't even know how to into a bank. You don't know which tools to use if you go into a cafe. Will I look ridiculous? Everything is frightening. But there's also all this stuff that you left behind that you have to work out. And I think that's how writing started for me, to try and make sense of that. Uh, and then once you start to do these things, it seems to me, then you're hooked and you want to make it work. So you can't stop.
That takes me to many of your characters from Hassan Umar to Daud or to Dottie Badura. And there they are, they're in a strange land that opens up. also a lot of possibilities for them. But sometimes they were born in England and are dealing with painful histories. And for a lot of your readers, I think you changed the way that we saw refugees, migrants, whether they were forced into migration or exile or not. We started to see them as resourceful, inventive. And this was many years before this became a topic that the world was looking towards with more urgency. And I just wanted to ask, what did your characters give you in these are the early to the middle stage books? And by slipping into their skins, did you start to see this huge experience shared the world over of migrating? Did that start to change for you?
Yeah, and also because I was reading, well, for a start, let me just respond to the first part of that. I do think there is something admirable in the way in the way that people um, find themselves after the kind of experience I just described, or even worse, when you hear stories of people who have been um, displaced because of violence or war, and then they make lives for themselves. I really think this is admirable. So, it wasn't something that was just my discovery. I also discovered it in what I was reading. Um, I got very interested and read a great deal at that time because it was new to me. And also because they were kind of in their pomp, as it were, a great many Jewish American writers, um, Bernard Malamud, Saul Bellow, many others, who wrote about experiences not dissimilar to these, or whose stories, anyway, also told stories, or whose stories told of experiences that were not dissimilar to the kind that I was going through in some way. So it wasn't my discovery that people who are displaced actually don't have to say I've been done a bad turn, but how do I find a way out of this? Or even with that, even it's not anything as rational as how do I find my way out of this? You do, or people do, on the whole, find a way out of whatever it is, the discomforts, and as we see, there's many of them do quite well out of it.
It's it's one of the most fascinating things about writing, how you might be writing in one time, one set of decades, but you're writing directly also into the future. And so many of your novels have stayed relevant.
You're making me into a prophet now.
I am a little bit.
That's fine. I'll take that.
But again, you're also taking us into the lost pieces of history. And a lot of the landscapes, a lot of the periods of time that you're writing about have to do with a different age of imperialism, right? There's a lot of German colonial history out there. There are parts of British colonial history in general that were less remarked on that or that were obliterated. And the whole thing of maps and what we are taught to look at and what we don't see, that came to you very early. You started to see these missing pieces of history. What happens when you put that into fiction? Does that actually start to change our imaginations?
Well, what it does to you, I don't know. But I mentioned that as there were two dimensions of being a displaced person. Or all I mean by that is, I mean, you could be coming from, oops, you could be coming from Belfast, moving to London, and that would also constitute a kind of displacement. I'm not trying to make a tragedy about being displaced, but think coming from such a a large distance, or at least a big difference from where you end up. I mentioned the two things. One is coming to terms with where you are, and the other is coming to terms with where you were before. But in between these two, there is, for somebody like myself, there is also the issue of, I said, self-representation, meaning how did the British think about me? And there is colonial history in between. How do they see themselves? In, of course, is to do with how people like me were represented. No, no, it's because I move it around and I keep missing the central point at which one should be speaking. Uh, so it was trying to think about that and thinking what stories are told to justify uh, the colonial presence in our part of the world that then made me think about power, right, paradise, which came out of, in part, out of that desire to say this is an incomplete story, not my story, but the story that we have is not full enough. There is another dimension which is missing here.
Again, a lot of people, including my generation, but also generations younger than me, were more or less brought up in the belief that colonialism was over. And this isn't a question about writing, it's more, uh, you kind of correct us on that. You say that we live in a world shaped very powerfully by colonialism, and there's still a reverberation. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about that. What is it that we miss out on when we think of colonialism as and empires as something that are part of the past?
Well, I mean, obviously, let's see if this makes a difference. Okay. Obviously, European colonialism, because there are different kinds of colonialisms in history, as it were. There are also colonialism that we're seeing being replayed right now in Europe itself, and the Russian form of colonialism, which was just colonizing adjacent cultures and societies. But that particular form of European colonialism, which was the one that crossed the seas and went to strange areas, at least strange so far as the Europeans were concerned, it transformed the world in those 400, 300, 200, 100 years or so of that process. And that we can't put back. We can't say what's been done can be undone, despite where in some cases there are attempts to do that. To say it's over is not to understand the causes, if you like, of so much of the conflict that is going on in the world now, in Africa, in the Middle East. Many of these conflicts arose out of decisions made for the administrative convenience of the colonizing powers. It is also not to understand the economic imbalances that continue to make it difficult for many societies to step out of uh, the shall we say the difficulties that they have with their economies, with their societies, and so on. So there are so many ways. This is not to say whose fault is it, because in many countries, of course, they've been independent for 50 years and more. So you say by now you should have sorted things out. But it's precisely because they cannot be sorted out. Borders cannot be changed. Nobody wants to give up a tiny inch of land. But these borders don't make sense in many cases and are often the cause of conflict. And look what's happening now in the formerly French territories of West Africa, where the French did not actually leave in any, you know, precise way. They kept their bases, they kept the currency, they made sure dependency continued, and all sorts of things. How can we say colonialism is over when you have these events taking place in our time?
Exactly. And I think one of the thing that's been most powerful about writers, and there are many of them in the audience as well, is that they give you a new way of seeing. Many years ago, Amitav Ghosh, who's here today, uh, had one of his characters put a compass on a map. And, when the circle was completed, you suddenly saw a relationship, a kinship between places that had been separated by national or international borders. And with you, you changed the way that we saw, or you helped us to see East Africa in full and also the Indian Ocean. And I just wanted to pause at that. You grew up with a very powerful relationship with the Indian Ocean, and then as a child, and then as an adult, you saw its history, the crossroads, the trade, uh, brutal side of it as well.
Uh, yes, she's an expert. I'm not. I keep missing my where this would go. I can't. It can't be the microphone. It must be me. Yeah, she knows how to hold a microphone. Yeah, I grew up in sight of the. I grew up in sight of the sea. Um, grew up inside of.
I'm so sorry about the
It's
mics.
okay. It's probably me. Uh, and also we had the Muslim trade, which meant every year people came from across the ocean. and where they arrived was more or less 100 yards from where we lived. So you saw the world coming to us, and the world meant the Indian Ocean. I hardly knew or cared very much about Paris or New York or anything like that. The world was what was across the ocean on the other side, uh, from both from not both, but from India, from South Arabia, Somalia, and even further afield from the Persian Gulf and so on. Uh, but of course, Amitav Ghosh, sitting there, has also written about exactly this and exactly this traffic of cultures and of people. Some of it driven by necessity, some of it driven by a desire to connect. And the British played their part in that, say, in the way that so many people from South Asia, from India in particular, uh, I'm thinking of India, of colonial India, so also people from what is now Pakistan, were brought over to our part of the world to perform specific functions in aid of the colonial administration. But this connection existed hundreds of years before that. This connection of people making their way from South Asia to East Africa and vice versa, of course. Uh, Indeed, the person who guided Vasco da Gama to Calicut, you would like to know, was an Indian. You can take pride in having aided the colonial project. Um, so these connections were there. It wasn't something new, but it wasn't written about from the point of view of where I would have been standing. I often used to think when I was reading, I did my PhD on African writing. And I often used to think with many of the things that I was reading, I don't see myself. And that's because it was an idea of Africa that was apparently being embraced in this writing and in the commentary of this writing, which did not take account of this other connection. So, so I often think also of what is East Africa as being the Western Indian Ocean, as another way of thinking about it.
That's one of the things that makes fiction so powerful. But I've always loved the fact that your novels can't be reduced easily. They're not just about immigration or migration. They're not just about war. They're not just about the aftermath of exile. I mean, in books like Paradise or Admiring Silence, many of your books, there's so much about relationships or falling in love or travel and discovering yourself, becoming a new person on a journey that you may or may not have wanted to undertake. Could you share with us a little bit about pleasure of writing, the pleasure of craft and voice and finding all your characters?
Uh, well, it isn't always pleasure, of course, which is not to say that it's misery either. Um, but there is a kind of, I suppose, how should I say, a kind of an everyday dimension also to writing. That is, um, and I speak only of myself because I'm sure everybody has their own way of going about the business of writing. But for me, it takes a while for something to kind of slowly grow, um, and then at some point it seems that yes, I've got hold of something, I've got something, and then to begin to write. By which time I do have a sense of who these people are, or beginning to have a sense of who these people are. Um, and the pleasure is actually coming to make them more and more credible, more and more feasible, and of course also making the what drives them, whatever the story is or whatever the events are, making that too plausible. So yeah, so the pleasure is like that, and then getting the right sentence can be very pleasing. And I don't know how that happens. So it's not a. What I mean is I don't know if there's a method for doing that aside from uh, hearing it and trying to imagine uh, uh, um, how it would sound, and then writing it down, and then seeing if the balance is right, and that kind of thing. Which is what I mean by just doing it in a kind of everyday way until you feel yes, the balance is right here. Let's move on. At least that's how I work. I don't work very quickly. I write until I feel it's okay now, um, and then I'll probably stop before I start tinkering too much.
Kept faith with the novel far more than many other writers. You've never wanted to veer towards short stories or poetry, even at the early stages?
No,
What is it about the novel that, keeps you coming back?
well, the novel's beautiful thing because it has so much in it. You can do such a, you can make it as complex as you want, or you can indeed proceed fast through it if you want. I have no problem with short stories either, but when I have tried to write, I've written a few, 6 or 7 or something like that. Usually because somebody has said, "Why don't you write me a short story?" And I say, "Okay, well, fine." But if I start independently to write a short story, I find that it doesn't remain short because I become interested. I think in um, so how did we get here? Because of the I think great short stories, not that I've written one, I don't know about that, but great short stories that I've read have a kind of limited moment, as it were. Um, and okay, they're satisfying in a sense, but actually, I'm probably not even a good reader of short stories because even when I finish reading, I think, well, then what happened to him? Or how did he come to be here? Or something like that. So I think that's why the novel appeals to me more than the short story. But I might also say I was also almost all the time that I was writing until just recently, I was also teaching and writing academic stuff, you know? So you can't add short stories and poetry to that as well. It was enough coping with these two things.
Yeah, it was a very full life. And there's a quote from Desertion that I love a great deal, which there is, as you can see, an I in this story, but it is not a story about me. It is about how one story contains many and how they belong not to us, but are part of the random currents of our time, and about how stories capture us and entangle us for all time. And what would you tell those in the audience? Many of them I know want to be writers. What would you tell them about the power or the responsibility or just the playfulness of storytelling?
I wouldn't dream of telling them anything, really, to be honest, because everybody has their own reason for wanting to undertake this business, which sometimes can be frustrating. I always say, I mean, if any advice to give to writers, whether they're young or old or whatever, is to say, don't give up. Just keep writing. That's all. I mean, the thing, the thing, what makes it so admirable, lovely about writing is that everybody does it for their own reasons. They have things to say for one kind or another. They don't always know. We don't always, not they, we don't always know what it is, what we want to say precisely. But there is some kind of desire to do it, whether it's to to dramatize a moment or an experience, whether it's to inquire, whether it's to condemn or to celebrate or whatever. All of these are fine. Just do it.
And that's a wonderful note on which to start to bring the audience in if they want to ask questions. I do have more that I wanted to ask you, but I think it's only fair to share, if that's all right. I see hands up from this side. Do we have a mic? Hi, do we have mics out? Okay. And while we're waiting for the audience to kick in, I really hope that you'll find the time after all of this touring to get back to writing
Oh, yeah.
yourself. And I just wanted to say, thank you for the 10 novels, for Hassan Umar and Daud, for Dottie and Yusuf and Aziz Uncle, and for Ilyas and Hamza and all of them.
Thank you. As soon as I start to speak, the microphone dies. No, it's all right. I can reassure you there's a new book coming already. It's done.
That's fantastic. I wasn't expecting it. Do you have a title?
Yes, the title is A Long Road. It should be. coming out sometime early next year.
Thank you. Please.
Yeah, I hope this microphone's working. So, um, from the time you went to England now, I mean, technology, information, it's made England more accessible, or a country that you migrate to more accessible. But has the process of migration become more difficult now than it was from the time you went? And I'm talking of in the perspective of stop the boats, etc. Has that made migration difficult? And how do you look at this from a country that has colonized pretty much the world and benefited disproportionately from it, to being able to stop people from coming into their country for their benefit?
Uh, there are several questions there. I'll take the easy ones and leave the difficult ones alone. Yes, I think it's different. I think there was, although it was also a time.
It's okay. We're good at the mic switch.
Although there was something about the times. I went to England in 1967, and pretty soon after that there was the infamous Rivers of Blood. And we think of that speech, Rivers of Blood, not because it was the worst thing, but because somehow it was um, an articulation of something. So what he said, Paul, was not something just off the top of his head. He was echoing something that was going on in the country. And you'll be amazed, actually, because I was there and I can tell you, you'll be amazed how many people actually embrace that from all sorts of different political positions. On the other hand, there was also a kind of gentleness about the way the authorities dealt with um, strangers, should I say, or migrants. Now there is a profound hostility to the way that people are received, not only because of the changes of the law, because these laws were still fresh and not fully understood, but who to keep out and who to let in. But in fact, there is a desire now to keep people out, even when there's good reason to allow them. I'm thinking of not so long ago, my nephew, rather unfortunately, a young man, died. And there was an attempt to try and get the family to the funeral, some of whom were in Germany, some were in Zanzibar, and they were just coming for the funeral. And it was almost impossible to get permission for these people just to come for a funeral, let alone to come and kind of whatever, work or live or something like that. So it's a completely different atmosphere about the welcome that strangers might receive.
Thank you. And we have a couple of questions from the lady at the back. Lady there.
Thank you for this talk, and it's amazing to like see you in person, or having read your books and having read so much about you. So, as a person who's venturing into academia, I was just curious to ask, like academia sort of wants us to have this eye of discernment while reading every text, and as a writer, you would more be interested in creating beautiful literature. So, as a person, how do you balance this two? Because I've read about you were a professor at University of Kent, if I'm right. So, how did this work? Like managing academia and having this critical eye when reading a text, and also having this eye for beautiful literature and writing beautiful lines. So, how does that work together?
It wasn't difficult. I mean, that's quite different kinds of activities. Even though on superficially it might seem that they
Because writing a thesis is very different from writing a novel, I suppose. So, and you aced both of it. So,
I guess that's what I'm saying too. So for that reason, there is no real conflict. It's just you do one thing and then you do the other thing. You don't do them at the same time. So when it's work time, you work, and then when you have time to, I mean, to do your own work, then you do that. One way I found that I made it work for myself is that I did all my academic work in my office at the university, and I did all my writing at home. I didn't do any academic work at home. unless I had to.
So a geographical separation, more or less. I did want to ask the Kolkata question before we get back to the audience, which is, what is it like being here? What's your experience of the city, or what have you read about the city before you came here?
Well, I've read Amitabh's books for a start, and I've read a fair amount over the both historically. City of Dreadful Night, I've read that. Um, Kipling, but I've also read, whatever one reads in the normal way of things. What's my experience of being here? Well, we came at night, so all I saw was traffic and cars getting annoyed with each other. I mean, people getting annoyed with each other. But today we drove through, and I saw that it is indeed a beautiful city, and of course a lovely audience.
We do have time for two more questions. So the gentleman in front, and is there anyone on the sides who's getting left out? Lady at the please. You're not. See, you're not the only one.
My respectful obeisance, Professor Gurnah. My question is, a few months back, in the Financial Times interview, you said that the post-liberation revolution in Zanzibar in 1964 January was racist. So it seems that you reject that it was a class struggle, right? And my reading of your novels, the description of violence that is there in your novels, maybe I'm wrong, tells me that your description of black racism and the violence that followed far outweighs the white racism of the 60s and the 70s. I'm reminded of Enoch Powell and the Rivers of Blood. Will you answer to this? Thank you.
I said that the revolution was racist, and it wasn't a class struggle, really. Uh, in any case, even if it was, so much of it ended up being a vengeful, racist program. Um, less so now, 50 years later, less so now. Partly because everything that is worth owning is actually now owned by those who made the revolution. So what you have now is regrettable in a different way. Why do I not write about British racism? I do. It's not that I don't. Um, but in a way, what I don't want to do in what I write is to be talking about what is rather obvious in front of us. And it's not really that interesting to me why race is still such a difficult issue for so many European societies, not just Britain. You can't just have to keep doing what you do and talk about what needs to be talked about, but the transformation has to come from within the societies themselves, not through accusations by people like me. So I'm more interested in understanding how people cope with it rather than the sources of it or what's behind the mind of the racist. That's not my interest, really, because at times it's difficult to understand the continuation of this hostility, which somehow or the other seems to recede and resurface, rather than that I know we're making progress, but somehow not. So, but that's not really, in a sense, what I'm really interested in, or is that's not really a problem I can do much about. But I am interested in understanding how people cope with uh, those sorts of circumstances.
We'll have to keep this short, but last question. Yours, ma'am.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Uh, I am an academician, and many students are working on you, writing their thesis paper under you, on you. And my question is just regarding paradise. So I have two questions on paradise. That one is that about the naming of Yusuf. Another is that the title, and what is the authorial intention of the ending of the novel Paradise. Only that much. Thank you very much.
I think that covers it all, pretty much.
But
Okay.
do you think I should answer that or not? Are you telling me not to answer? Let me give a brief answer. The Yusuf, of course, is an attempt to echo the story of Yusuf, the Quranic Yusuf or the biblical Joseph, um, a beautiful boy who in fact is captive. Except, of course, um, this is a more tragic version than the biblical Quranic one. And why call it paradise? Because at the time I was very interested in representations of paradise, particularly Muslim representations of paradise and what paradise consisted of. But ultimately, it is ironic about the land through which they travel.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your life in writing. I cannot wait to start reading The Long Road. And
I'm sorry, do I have to get this right?
sorry,
A long road.
A Long Road. I'm
The,
sorry about
the
that.
article's critical.
I get it. And you've been a wonderful audience. Abdulrazak Gurnah's books are at the bookstores, so please take a look if you want to. Thank you so much, Abdulrazak. Okay. Would you like to do that? And Abdulrazak Gurnah will be signing his books at the bookstore. So if anyone of you want to go over and get your book signed, here's your chance.